Well, hello. My name is Bob Bogard. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications at the Palm Springs Art Museum. The museum is located here in downtown Palm Springs. We've been around since 1938. Originally, the museum started as a museum to teach people about the plants and animals in the area, but eventually we started collecting art, and then really collecting art in the 1950s and 1960s. And about 6 years ago, we changed our name from the Palm Springs Desert Museum to the Palm Springs Art Museum. We are a 150,000 square foot museum that features art with modern and contemporary art. We have Western Native American art, architecture, design, glass, and photography. So what you see behind me is just a small selection of what are the kind of the art that we have here in the Palm Springs Art Museum. This is a sculpture by a Japanese artist named Nara. It's a big, oversized dog. It's called Your Dog. And it's actually one of the most friendly pieces that we have here in the museum. Directly behind me is one of our newest acquisitions, which is a painting by Marc Chagall, very famous Russian painter, and there's only 6 of these in the world. We are very honored to have it. It's actually a series of 12 different tiles that are painted upon, and the whole thing weighs about 300 pounds, and so we had to build a special wall to support it. That was just recently given to us by one of our longtime patrons. Directly next to that, we have some Picasso sculptures. The sculptures are very interesting because Picasso is typically known for doing paintings, but he also did a couple sculptures, including there's a bronze owl that was modeled after an owl that Picasso had as a pet. He rescued it, and he made this sculpture as kind of a tribute to it. He calls it the Angry Owl. And it's a really beautiful sculpture. It's actually quite rare, and we're very honored to have it in the museum. Most of the works that we have here in the museum have been donated by our patrons that support us. Although Palm Springs is a small town of only about 46,000 people, we have quite a large number of very affluent people who support us, not only financially, but also with works of art. And so most of the works that you'll see here in the museum have been donated or loaned to us by these very affluent people. And we have some very important pieces in our collection. We have some Henry Moore sculptures. We have a painting by an Italian futurist named Severini. We have an Italian sculptor, Modigliani. We have some really important glass works by Lino Tagliapietra, who's an Italian artist, as well as Dale Chihuly, who's an American artist. And quite a lot of other very famous pieces in our collection. What I'd like to show you now is some of our other works in our glass section and our Native American section. So we're standing right now in the Kaplan Ostergaard Glass Center. This is a really amazing and very popular section of the museum. Glass art is particularly interesting to people, I think, because glass is something that you interact with every single day, whether it's holding a glass of water or drinking, maybe a soda or even touching a window pane. You have an interaction with glass that you might not have if it's a painting or a sculpture. But what's interesting about the glassworks that we have here are the incredible variety of styles that you see here. Some of them are, as you can see, sculptures that are made out of different pieces of glasses. There's also really beautiful blown glass structures here that have done. This is done by Lino Tagliapietra, who's probably the most important glass blower in the world. And one of the interesting things about this particular piece is that he sketches out the entire look of the vessel before it's ever created, and then puts it together with these glass rods and blows the glass. And it's a very delicate and dangerous process. If you don't do it correctly within the first 40 minutes or so, the entire piece is lost and you have to restart over again. It's a very complicated process, and there's only very few people in the world that can blow something that's this kind of complexity. But then you also have something like that compared to some of the other pieces that we have that are what's called a fused glass, where you're taking glass rods and then putting them together and sort of melting them together, and then they fuse into one big piece of glass. So it's really a nice example that you can have the same material, glass, but have it in an extraordinarily wide number of types of implementations. So right now we're in the western wing of the Palm Springs Art Museum. We have been around since 1938, and we've been collecting art since the very early times of the museum. Some of the works that we have here on display, in fact, this painting right here is the very first painting that the museum ever collected. It's a painting about the Grand Canyon. It was painted in 1915. So these works are some of the original works that we started collecting, and they're very popular pieces. When people come to Palm Springs, which is in Southern California, they're not quite sure what the environment is like, and so we like to really focus some of the paintings in this wing about some of the natural areas that they would see. They could be landscapes, or they could be some of the plants that are featured here locally. So we have some really beautiful paintings. The one over here to my left is a painting that is called the Donner Pass. There's a very famous area in California where there was a family called the Donner family that were trying to get over to get to San Francisco, and they were stuck there during a very horrible blizzard for several months. Many of them died, and they in fact actually had to resort to cannibalism to stay alive with some of the people that had passed away. That's a painting that's located there. There's also some other paintings about the American Southwest here, and we also have some really beautiful bronze sculptures here in the museum. But when people think about art of the West, they really think about sort of bronze cowboy sculptures, but in fact, art of the West is continuing going on even now in the 21st century. So we feature some modern works as well as some historic works like the bronze cowboy sculpture. We're right now in the Native American section of the Palm Springs Art Museum, and we have a collection of very ancient pieces. We have some pieces that go down back to about 1,000 years. We have some very old basketry. We also have some contemporary works that are done by Native Americans. And our goal here is to show that there was quite a wide range of art that was created by Native Americans. These baskets, for example, were not really meant to be art. They were actually baskets used by the local tribe, which is called the Cahuilla Band of Indians. And these baskets were meant to be functional, but they also are really gorgeous. Many of them feature animals or are very intricate designs that are located in them. They are actually very fragile works, and so most of the time in the museum, we don't really separate people from the art itself, but in this case, we have to have a container like this to preserve the basket because it's very fragile. It's actually made out of grasses and reeds. And in fact, many of the baskets that we have in our collection have degraded over time, and so right now we're actively repairing them and restoring them back to their original conditions, which is a difficult process because many times the actual process of creating the basket that process has been lost in time, and so we have to try to find somebody who actually knows the intricacy of creating a basket like this. We actually have the largest collection of Cahuilla basketry of anywhere in the world, probably because we started in 1938, and those are the easiest things to collect at that time. And so one of the things that the museum does is not only to collect art, but also to preserve art. And so what you see here is just a small fraction. We have literally about 1,000 of these types of baskets in our storeroom, but we only are displaying probably about 30 at any given time because they are so fragile. We switch them out every once in a while. But we are also in the business of preserving art for future generations. What you can see behind me is a collection of our Mesoamerican sculptures. We have a very interesting and wide collection of sculptures that were created by indigenous people in Central and South in North America. That was all before the Europeans came to the United States and to Central and South America. And so what the kind of exhibition that we have going on right now is we have the figures sort of lined up against the railing, and then displayed over to my right here we have some spyglasses, so that if you were sort of a European explorer coming to the New World, you'd be able to look through the spyglass, and then they're trained to look specifically at the sculptures across the way. This is a way to sort of like to remind people that they're actually of the old and the new, and the conquest of the Americas by the Europeans. Also on this level, we have some very interesting modern sculptures. We have an Italian artist, Modigliani. That's probably one of our most valuable pieces of art. We also have some Henry Moore sculptures. He's a British sculptor. And many of these are very sort of abstract sculptures. Why they're interesting is in the 1950s, when these were being created, the idea was that there was still a very idea that like a human form would look like a human form, arms, legs, heads. Henry Moore came along and said, why does it have to be like that? And so he would make a sculpture with a small head and a really misshapen body with no arms. And it was really not understood at the time. It's now looked at as a really brilliant way of reimagining sculpture. But at the time, it wasn't so popular. The family that collected it, they're named the Wieners, gave their entire collection to the museum, and we've had this as part of our collection since the 1970s. We are now on the upper level of the Palm Springs Art Museum, and this is the area that we have a lot of our modern and contemporary works. In fact, the work that's next to me is a spider that was done by an artist named Louise Bourgeois. She died about a year ago. Her parents were weavers, and so she did a lot of spiders, not because she thought they were kind of scary, but because they sort of spin a web and they are like her parents with weavers. In fact, the spider on this particular one has some hooks and some instruments that look like what weavers would use for their tools. We're not in the business of selling art. We don't really talk about the value of art, but we're always asked, what is your most valuable piece of art? And this actually would be our most valuable piece if we were to sell anything. This is valued at about $10 million right now. And this is actually a pretty small version of one of the works that she does. She's had works that are about 40, 50 feet high, and so they're really massive spiders, if you can imagine. Also on this level up here, we have a sculpture by a German artist named Anselm Kiefer, and then we have a sculpture here that's by a British artist named Anthony Gormley. This particularly is, I think, a beautiful work because it is all done with rectangular or square cubes, but yet they're put together in such a way that they create a fluid motion. So if you think about each one of those is a piece that has very flat angular surfaces, and yet he's able to create this beautiful arched approach to it. And it's all welded from the inside, so it looks like someone just sort of like put these all together, but in fact they're all welded from the inside. So we have, this is just an example of some of the many pieces of modern and contemporary art that we have here at the museum. Of hundreds of small little acrylic cubes, and it's displayed in an area in a way that sort of looks like a map of the world, but in fact it's actually meant to be an abstract work. It's actually called Ivy. And what's interesting about it is that if you look at it, they look like they're actually green cubes, but if you look from the side, you can see that the green is really on the piece that's actually against the wall, and in fact the entire cube is actually clear. Each one of these cubes has a little pin on it, so it's like it's kind of stuck into the wall like that. When we received this work, it was all these individual pieces, and it was like a very complicated game in a way that we had to actually put these together in this pattern. But one of the reasons that the artist does that is he likes the museum to interpret how it should go, and so there's a certain flexibility of where we wanted to put these pieces. But we did it so that sort of like the darker pieces were on here and then kind of like flowed down to the lighter pieces here. It's a really beautiful work, but because of the amount of work that we did to it, we probably will never move this piece. The mirror that's on the lower level is slightly at an angle so that when you look in, it has the approach of being a tunnel that kind of curves and goes down endlessly down to the lower level of the museum. So this is another very lifelike sculpture. This one is by an artist named John D'Andrea, and again, it's kind of a resin that's something like this, but it's treated in such a way that you would swear this was a real woman laying here. In fact, if you look at her feet, you can see that they're kind of wrinkled and they've got calluses, and it looks like it's a real woman laying there. The family that donated this work to us used to have this in their bathroom right next to the bathtub, and so when you would walk into the bathroom, it looked like there was a nude woman sitting next to the bathtub, and it was always like a big shock, and they thought it was very funny when people would walk in and see that. But it's a really gorgeous display of work. In fact, the kind of craftsmanship on this is uncanny. Even her face is so incredibly lifelike, you would swear that was a real person laying there. We're right now in one of the two outdoor sculpture gardens that we have here at the Palm Springs Art Museum. We're actually below street level. The reason for that is the architect, when he was building this building, wanted to have it a certain height, but the city restrictions wouldn't allow the building to be that way, so the only way he could do it is to go down into the ground. So we have these 2 outdoor sculpture gardens, and this is actually where we have a lot of our really beautiful outdoor sculptures, including this work that's behind me right here. This is a glass work that's done by an artist named Dale Chihuly, who is probably the most famous glass blower in America. And this is a really interesting piece. It's made up of 75 different individual glass works that are all hooked together on a frame on the inside. And this was done for the Venice Biennale that they have every other year in Venice. And this was actually over one of the canals. There's only 4 of these in the world, and we're lucky to have one of them here in Palm Springs. Well, I hope you've enjoyed your tour of the Palm Springs Art Museum in beautiful California. We invite you to come back and see it. Right, you just saw just a fraction of what we have here available. In fact, only 10% of what we have, or actually 90% of what we have is in storage, so you only saw about 10% of what we actually have, and we're constantly changing that around. So every month we have a different exhibition or new art that we're featuring. So we welcome you to come back whenever you like.